"Get out of my house!" I shouted as the HOA Karen froze mid-step. Charlotte Williams had just used her master key to break into my home like she owned the place, clipboard in hand, demanding to inspect my garage paint color. For 2 weeks, this woman had been harassing my elderly mother and me, filing bogus violations, taking photos of our private property. She thought we were just another family she could intimidate into submission. Charlotte had no idea who she was really dealing with. What happened next will blow your mind. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever dealt with an HOA nightmare? I've been a sheriff for 15 years, and in all that time I've seen plenty of people who think a little authority makes them untouchable. But I never expected one to literally walk into my mother's house while I was drinking my morning coffee. The sound of that master key turning in the lock. Well, let's just say it's not something you forget. Charlotte Williams, 52 years old and HOA president, for the past 4 years stood in the doorway like she belonged there, her clipboard clutched against her chest like a shield. She was wearing her usual uniform, navy blazer, pressed khakis, and that expression of righteous indignation that seemed permanently etched on her face. "Mr. Turner," she announced, not even bothering with pleasantries. "This is an emergency compliance inspection under Article 7 of the Community Charter." I set my coffee mug down slowly, watching her scan the living room with the intensity of a detective at a crime scene. The thing is, Charlotte had no idea who she was dealing with. To her, I was just Aaron Turner, the unemployed guy who'd moved back in with his 70-year-old mother Barbara after his divorce 6 months ago. That was the story everyone in Meadowbrook Estates knew, and I'd done nothing to correct it. Being on administrative leave pending a corruption investigation wasn't exactly something I advertised to the neighbors. So, when Charlotte started her little power play, I decided to let her run with it. Sometimes the best way to catch someone breaking the law is to give them enough rope to hang themselves with. And boy, was Charlotte about to weave herself a noose. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures of everything: the coffee table, the couch, even the family photos on the mantle. "I'm documenting potential violations for the HOA board meeting next Tuesday," she explained, though I hadn't asked. Each photo came with a little editorial comment. The throw pillows were non-compliant color scheme. The potted plant by the window was vegetation placement violation. I just nodded along, playing the part of the confused resident who didn't understand the rules. The whole time I was making mental notes. Unlawful entry, check. Harassment, check. Invasion of privacy, check. Charlotte was building quite the case against herself, and she didn't even know it. What really got my attention was the piece of paper she waved around as justification for having that master key. "Emergency safety alert," she called it, showing me an official-looking document with a barely visible seal. Apparently last year, the entire community had their locks replaced with a standardized system, and some residents, including my mother, had signed up for emergency maintenance access. It was supposed to be for situations like water leaks or fire hazards. Charlotte had somehow gotten her hands on a copy of that master key, claiming authority under some obscure safety provision. The whole thing reeked of bureaucratic manipulation, but I had to admit she'd covered her legal bases pretty well. Almost well enough. The woman clearly had issues that went deeper than just power tripping. As she continued her inspection, she kept muttering about safety protocols and liability concerns. "I can't have another tragedy like what happened at the community pool," she said, more to herself than to me. That caught my attention. 2 years ago, there'd been a drowning incident involving a child at the neighborhood pool. The family had sued the HOA, claiming inadequate safety measures. Charlotte had been in charge of pool maintenance at the time, and the incident had clearly left its mark on her. She'd become obsessed with rules and regulations, ever since, as if following every single guideline could somehow prevent future disasters. It was almost sad, really. Almost. But sympathy only goes so far when someone's violating your civil rights. I watched Charlotte photograph my mother's prescription bottles on the kitchen counter, documenting what she called potential pharmaceutical violations. That's when I knew this had gone too far. My mom, Barbara, had been dealing with asthma for years, and her medications were properly prescribed and stored. Charlotte had no business photographing them, let alone making implications about pharmaceutical violations. I made my first move, then calmly suggesting that maybe she should come back with proper notice next time. Her response was immediate and telling. "Emergency inspections don't require advance notice, Mr. Turner. I suggest you familiarize yourself with the community guidelines." The condescension in her voice was thick enough to cut with a knife. She handed me a copy of the HOA violation notice she'd been preparing while standing in my living room. $100 for unauthorized exterior color modification. Apparently, the garage door my mom had painted last month was 3 shades too dark according to the approved color palette. Another $50 for landscaping non-compliance because the rose bushes were allegedly 6 inches too close to the property line. The list went on and on, each item more ridiculous than the last. But here's the thing about being a cop for 15 years. You learn to recognize patterns. Charlotte's behavior wasn't just annoying, it was systematic harassment disguised as rule enforcement. As she prepared to leave, I reached for my leather notebook, the same one I had been using to document evidence for years. In front of Charlotte, I calmly wrote down the date, time, and nature of her visit. "Just keeping my own records," I told her, with a slight smile. She seemed pleased by this, probably thinking she'd intimidated me into compliance. If only she knew that notebook had been used to document evidence in dozens of criminal cases over the years. I drew a small check mark next to the entry, my first piece of evidence in what I suspected would become a much larger case. Charlotte Williams had just made her first major mistake, and I had it all documented. But Charlotte didn't know about the black box in my mother's bedroom closet. Hidden behind old photo albums and winter coats was a backup security system I had installed 10 years ago. A redundant camera system that automatically recorded anyone entering the house. The system was old school, the kind that stored footage on physical drives rather than cloud storage. Most people had forgotten about these older systems, but I'd kept it running as a backup to the backup. Charlotte had just been recorded committing unlawful entry, and she had no idea the evidence existed. That black box was going to contain something that would make her panic completely when she eventually found out about it. The next morning brought a different kind of harassment. The digital variety. My phone started buzzing at 6 a.m. with notifications from the HOA community app. Charlotte had apparently spent her evening documenting every possible violation she could imagine, uploading photos and creating violation reports through the system. 24-hour compliance notification, she called it. I had to upload photos of my entire exterior property within 1 day or face additional fines. The app kept pinging every hour, with reminder notifications creating a constant stream of digital pressure designed to wear down anyone's resistance. It was psychological warfare disguised as property management, and I had to admit it was pretty effective if you didn't know what you were dealing with. But Charlotte's masterstroke was even more subtle than the app harassment. When I walked outside to get the newspaper, I noticed fresh red paint along the curb in front of our house. Overnight, someone had painted a red line extending from the fire hydrant down to our driveway, effectively creating a no parking zone where none had existed before. The paint was still tacky to the touch when I ran my finger along it, barely dry. Suddenly, any car parked in front of our house would be in violation of fire lane regulations, generating automatic tickets through the HOA's new digital enforcement system. It was brilliant in its simplicity and completely illegal in its execution, but proving who was responsible would be another matter entirely. The black box in my mother's closet was already pulling its weight in a different way. I swapped in a fresh drive before dawn, logged the serial number, and photographed the meter panel and door jamb for a clean timestamp trail. The old recorder stamped entries to the second and watermarked frames with an internal clock I'd calibrated last month against the courthouse time server. If Charlotte or anyone else stepped over that threshold again, the footage my chain of custody notes and the stills would stack together without gaps. I didn't need the cloud. I needed a record no one in her little universe could quietly edit or make disappear. Around noon, I put on my best interview outfit, navy suit, conservative tie, leather briefcase, and walked to my car like I was heading to yet another job interview. The neighbors who saw me probably felt bad. Here was this guy in his late 30s, living with his mother, struggling to find work after some kind of professional setback. Mrs. Wilson from next door even called out, "Good luck today," as I drove away. If only she knew I wasn't actually going to an interview. I was going to work just like I had every day for the past 6 months. The only difference was that I changed into my sheriff's uniform in the parking garage behind the courthouse instead of at home. Being on administrative leave didn't mean I was sitting around doing nothing. The corruption investigation that had sidelined me was actually winding down, and most days I was back in the office handling administrative duties and training new recruits. The investigation itself involved a contractor who had been overcharging the county for road maintenance, small-scale stuff that had nothing to do with my patrol duties. But administrative leave meant I couldn't wear the uniform home, couldn't park the patrol car in my driveway, couldn't do anything that might compromise the investigation's integrity. So I developed this elaborate routine of changing clothes in the parking garage, maintaining the fiction that I was just another unemployed guy looking for work. In the courthouse garage, I sat behind tinted glass and buttoned a uniform I wasn't supposed to wear home. 15 years on the job, and I was changing in a concrete stall to keep a clean wall between my street and an investigation that was almost done. My captain said to hold steady. I did. No patrol car in the driveway, no badge on the porch, nothing a defense attorney could twist into noise. So I zipped the bag, locked it in the trunk, and drove back like every other neighbor, with a day they didn't care to explain, while Charlotte kept mistaking secrecy for weakness. When I got home that evening, my mother was waiting with a worried expression and her phone in her hand. "Aaron, honey," she said, "I got a call from someone asking questions about you. They wanted to know about your work situation, whether you were having financial problems, things like that." The caller had identified themselves as being from a community wellness initiative, but when my mom asked for more details, they'd hung up. It didn't take a detective to figure out who was behind the fishing expedition. Charlotte was trying to gather information, probably hoping to find some kind of leverage or weakness she could exploit. The woman was thorough, I had to give her that. But Charlotte had just received a phone call that would change everything, though I wouldn't find out about it until later. The call came from a number she didn't recognize, and the voice on the other end was professional but cold. When she answered, the person simply said, "Ms. Williams, this is regarding the Meadowbrook Estates situation. We need to meet." The caller wouldn't identify themselves over the phone, but they knew details about Charlotte's HOA activities that should have been private. By the time the call ended, Charlotte's face had gone pale and her hands were shaking. Someone else was watching her activities, and whoever it was had access to information that made Charlotte very, very nervous. The psychological pressure was definitely taking its toll on my mother, though she tried not to show it. Barbara Turner had lived in this house for 30 years, raised her children here, and never had problems with any neighbors. By noon, I drove to the county public works counter and asked for the most recent curb paint orders for our block. The clerk scrolled a terminal and shook her head. No authorization, no service ticket, no emergency fire access revision. She printed a blank record with today's date and stamped it received at my request. On the way out, I stopped at the hardware store near the freeway and asked about red enamel that dries glossy in cool air. The owner said a woman bought 2 small cans around midnight and paid cash, no loyalty scan, no name. He remembered because she asked if it would cover over gray curb in one coat. I did not need a confession. I needed a chain of small facts that pointed the same direction. Now suddenly, she was afraid to check her mail because Charlotte might be watching, afraid to tend her garden because someone might report her for landscaping violations. The constant appy notifications on her phone, Charlotte had somehow added her to the HOA communication system, were making her jumpy and anxious. This was exactly what harassers counted on wearing down their victims through constant low-level pressure, until compliance seemed like the only way to make it stop. But Charlotte had picked the wrong family to mess with. That night, I opened my leather notebook and built the case by the hour. I blocked out a timeline with call times, curb photos, and app pings, then cross-referenced each item to a location and a name. The point wasn't to write slogans about process. It was to line up cause and effect until the pattern stopped arguing back. Charlotte's late-night notices, the fresh paint on the curb, the bogus 24-hour compliance push. Each went to its own page with a timestamp and a short note on impact. By the time I capped my pen, what happened to my mother wasn't a pile of annoyances anymore. It had a sequence and it had intent. The invisible pressure was designed to break people down slowly, to make them feel isolated and powerless against bureaucratic authority. But here's what Charlotte didn't understand about cops. We're trained to recognize these patterns because we see them all the time, in domestic abuse cases, stalking cases, harassment cases. The tactics were always the same. Start small, escalate gradually, make the victim feel like they're crazy for complaining about little things. But little things add up, and when you document them properly, they tell a story that juries understand perfectly. Charlotte Williams was about to learn that lesson the hard way. 3 days later, Charlotte escalated to her next phase: public opinion warfare. The HOA newsletter arrived in everyone's mailbox on Thursday morning, featuring a prominent article about rising violation rates in Sector 7, which happened to be our street. The article included a blurred photo of our house taken from across the street, along with a bar graph showing how violations had increased dramatically over the past month. What the article didn't mention was that virtually all of those violations were complaints Charlotte herself had filed against our property. She'd created her own statistics, then used them to justify increased enforcement actions. It was propaganda masquerading as community journalism, and it was extremely effective. But Charlotte had made a crucial error in her rush to build a case against us. When I studied the violation list she'd attached to the newsletter, I noticed something interesting about the formatting. 5 of the 23 violations listed were clearly copy-pasted from other addresses. The font was slightly different, and one entry still showed 1247 Oak Street, instead of our address on Maple Drive. Charlotte had been so eager to pad her numbers that she'd literally copied violations from other properties and changed the addresses. Well, she'd tried to change the addresses anyway. This kind of document fraud was exactly the sort of sloppy evidence handling that could destroy a case in court, except this time Charlotte was building the case against herself. The mysterious phone call from the previous chapter, that had been from the attorney representing the family involved in the drowning incident at the community pool 2 years ago. Charlotte had been a witness in that case, and apparently the lawyer was concerned about some inconsistencies in Charlotte's statements. The family was considering reopening their lawsuit, and Charlotte's current behavior, documented through social media posts and community complaints, suggested she might be experiencing some kind of psychological breakdown related to the original incident. Why would a lawyer call just as Charlotte started harassing me? That was a question that would become very important very soon. The community response to the newsletter was exactly what Charlotte had hoped for. I watched from my front window as neighbors walked by, some glancing at our house with disapproval, others whispering to each other as they passed. Mrs. Wilson, who had wished me luck on my job interview just days before now, avoided eye contact entirely. The Thompsons from 2 houses down crossed the street rather than walk directly past our property. This was small-town social dynamics at their worst. People choosing sides based on incomplete information, letting fear override their better judgment. Charlotte had weaponized the neighborhood's desire for peace and property values, turning our neighbors into unwitting accomplices in her harassment campaign. But not everyone was buying Charlotte's narrative. Emma Wilson, Mrs. Wilson's daughter, who lived in the house next door, approached me that evening while I was bringing in the garbage cans. Emma was in her 30s, worked as a nurse at the county hospital, and had always been friendly with my mother. "Aaron," she said quietly, looking around to make sure no one was watching, "I need to tell you something about Charlotte. She's been doing this to other people too." Emma explained that Charlotte had targeted at least 3 other families over the past year, always using the same tactics: minor violation, complaints that escalated to harassment, social pressure through the newsletter, and threats of legal action. In each case, the families had eventually given up and moved away rather than fight the HOA. Emma wanted to help, but she was scared. "Charlotte threatened to sue me over my garden last month," she admitted. "She claimed my tomato plants were too close to the property line, but I've had that garden for 5 years without any problems." The fear in Emma's voice was real. Charlotte had created an atmosphere where neighbors were afraid to speak up, afraid to defend each other, afraid to challenge her authority, even when they knew she was wrong. This kind of systematic intimidation was exactly what domestic abusers relied on, isolating their victims, making them feel like resistance was futile, creating a community of silence where abuse could flourish unchecked. That evening, Charlotte received another call from the same mysterious number. This time, the conversation lasted longer, and by the end of it, Charlotte was practically in tears. The caller had information about her HOA activities, detailed knowledge of her harassment tactics, and seemed to know things about the pool incident that weren't in the public record. "Ms. Williams," the voice said calmly, "your current behavior is creating liability issues for people who prefer to avoid legal complications. I suggest you reconsider your approach to community relations." When Charlotte tried to ask who was calling, the line went dead. Someone was watching her activities very closely, and whoever it was had enough information to make her very nervous indeed. I laid her paperwork out like a map and started with what didn't fit. 5 entries in the newsletter list carried a different font weight, and one still showed 1247 Oak Street. The quarterly inspection dates drifted a day off the app's push times, and 2 photos tagged to our address showed a fence style no one on Maple Drive owns. The trick wasn't volume, it was drift small shifts that make a short story look old. By the end, the narrative she tried to sell had holes you could drive a patrol unit through. The social isolation strategy was working exactly as Charlotte intended. My mother stopped going to her weekly bridge game because the other ladies were treating her differently. The mailman started leaving packages at the neighbor's house instead of our front door. Even the grocery store checkout clerks who'd known my family for years seemed uncomfortable when we came in. Charlotte had successfully painted us as the neighborhood troublemakers, the family that brought down property values and disrupted community harmony. The irony was thick enough to choke on. We were being ostracized for being victims of harassment, while the actual harasser was being treated as a concerned community leader. But Charlotte had made one crucial miscalculation in her campaign of public manipulation. The mystery caller had asked about Aaron Turner, specifically wanting to know about his background, his work situation, his family connections. Charlotte assumed this was just due diligence from someone concerned about neighborhood stability. She had no idea that the caller already knew exactly who I was and what I did for a living. That phone call wasn't about gathering information. It was about delivering a warning. Someone with connections to the legal system was watching Charlotte's activities, and they were not pleased with what they were seeing. The pressure was building on multiple fronts now. Charlotte had the community convinced that we were the problem, while simultaneously dealing with mysterious phone calls that suggested someone with serious authority was taking an interest in her behavior. She was caught between her public position as the responsible HOA president and private fears that her past actions were coming back to haunt her. The lawyer's call about the pool incident had shaken her confidence, and these new mysterious contacts were making her paranoid. Charlotte Williams was starting to realize that she might not be as untouchable as she'd thought, but she was too committed to her current path to back down now. The attorney's follow-up wasn't about rumors, it was about paper. Work orders showed the pool's suction covers on, backorder the alarm panel bypassed for testing, and weekly checklists pencil-whipped, with the same initials Charlotte used on newsletter proofs. The gap between what she filed and what the maintenance log showed wasn't a disagreement, it was exposure. With a wrongful death suit stirring again, every overreach on our street read like panic written in policy speak. Saturday morning brought Charlotte's boldest move, yet a line-of-sight inspection of our property conducted from the public sidewalk. She arrived at 8 a.m. sharp with a professional-looking camera and a surveyor's clipboard, positioning herself directly across from our house. For 2 hours, she photographed every visible surface, taking notes and measurements like she was documenting a crime scene. When I stepped outside to get the newspaper, she called out cheerfully, "Just conducting our quarterly exterior compliance review, Mr. Turner. Nothing to worry about." The woman had absolutely no shame about her invasive behavior, treating it as perfectly normal community management rather than stalking. I responded by placing a large handwritten sign in our front window, "No consent to interior inspections," in bold black letters. The sign was perfectly legal. Property owners have every right to refuse entry to HOA representatives, even those with master keys. But Charlotte's reaction was immediate and telling. Within minutes, she was on her phone, apparently calling someone in authority. I could hear fragments of her conversation from across the street, refusing to comply with safety inspections, and potential code violations that require immediate access. She was clearly trying to manufacture some kind of emergency justification for forcing entry, but she was struggling to find anyone willing to back her up. The second wave of invasion came that afternoon, and this time Charlotte brought backup. Marcus Thompson, the HOA's newly appointed safety chair, arrived with Charlotte around 2 p.m., both of them carrying official-looking folders and wearing expressions of grim determination. Marcus was a retired accountant in his 60s, who'd moved to the neighborhood last year and apparently bought into Charlotte's safety-first rhetoric completely. "Mr. Turner," Charlotte said as they came up the walk, "today's task is an interior safety verification pursuant to Article 12. She held the folder like a warrant and told Marcus to start a checklist for smoke detectors, exit paths, and anything she could call a hazard if she needed to justify fees later. The master key came out again, and this time I let them enter while keeping my phone's timer running and camera recording. I wanted every second of this documented. "I'm explicitly denying consent for this entry," I said, clearly making sure my phone caught the audio. "I'm requesting that you leave this property immediately, and this request is being recorded." Charlotte's response was to waive that same emergency authorization document she'd shown before, though this time I noticed the signatures looked suspiciously fresh. "Emergency powers override privacy concerns, Mr. Turner," she said with obvious satisfaction. "Community safety takes precedence over individual preferences." They moved through the house systematically, Charlotte taking photos while Marcus made notes on his clipboard. At the hall, she pivoted from the kitchen entirely and tried to inventory our private spaces, measuring the distance from smoke detector to headboard and peering at framed family documents on the wall as if certificates were contraband. She called out that she needed to verify sleeping area safety and storage, and reached for my mother's bedroom knob like it was a cabinet in a model home. I stepped between her and the door and stated clearly and on camera that any entry into a private bedroom without consent would be documented as unlawful. She didn't answer. She just squared her shoulders and pretended not to hear me. The real confrontation came when they tried to enter my mother's bedroom. Charlotte had her hand on the doorknob when I stepped in front of her. "Ma'am, you stop right there," I said. And something in my voice made both of them freeze. For the first time since this whole thing started, I let a hint of my actual authority show through. It wasn't much, just a subtle shift in tone, a straightening of posture, the kind of presence that comes from 15 years of dealing with people who think they're above the law. Charlotte's hand fell away from the doorknob, and she took an involuntary step backward. "You have no right to enter my mother's private bedroom," I continued. "Every step you take in this house is being documented as unlawful entry." And Marcus Thompson was getting uncomfortable with the entire situation. "Charlotte," he said quietly, "maybe we shouldn't go in the bedroom. I mean, we've documented the common areas." But Charlotte was too invested in her power play to back down now. She glanced at her watch, fired off a message to someone labeled "safety chair" in her phone, and said she would recommend a lien for obstruction and a fast-track fine schedule if we didn't cooperate. She reached for the bedroom doorknob again, and that's when I physically blocked her hand. "Ma'am," I said, "stop right there," I told her, and this time there was no mistaking the authority in my voice. Charlotte stared at me for a long moment, clearly trying to process this sudden shift in our dynamic. But what shocked me wasn't Charlotte's reaction to my intervention. It was the sound of my mother calling 911 from the kitchen. I could hear her voice in the background, shaky but determined. "Yes, I need an ambulance. My asthma is acting up badly, and I can't catch my breath." It wasn't about Charlotte at all. The stress of the past weeks, combined with strangers invading her private space and photographing her medications, had triggered one of my mother's worst asthma attacks in years. The irony was devastating. Charlotte was so focused on documenting pharmaceutical violations that she'd actually created a genuine medical emergency right in front of her. The emergency services response was swift and professional. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes, immediately focusing on my mother's breathing difficulties, while Charlotte and Marcus stood around looking completely out of place. The lead paramedic, a woman named Jennifer, who'd been on the job for years, quickly assessed the situation. "Ma'am, has there been any unusual stress in your environment lately?" she asked my mother while checking her oxygen levels. My mother, between breathing treatments, managed to explain about the HOA harassment, the constant inspections, and the feeling of being under surveillance in her own home. Jennifer's expression grew increasingly stern as she listened. "Who authorized photographing this patient's medications?" Jennifer asked, turning to Charlotte with obvious professional concern. In her role as a paramedic, Jennifer had seen plenty of situations where harassment and stress triggered serious medical events, especially in elderly patients with pre-existing conditions. Charlotte's response was to waive her authorization document again, but Jennifer wasn't impressed. "This is a private medical emergency," she told Charlotte firmly. "I need you to stop taking photos and leave this room immediately." For the first time in weeks, someone with actual authority was telling Charlotte Williams exactly what I'd been wanting to say. Charlotte's confident facade finally began to crack under the pressure of dealing with real emergency responders who weren't impressed by her HOA credentials. "But this is an official safety inspection," she protested weakly. "I have authorization under the community charter." Jennifer cut her off with the kind of professional authority that Charlotte's fake emergency powers couldn't match. "Ma'am, this is now a medical scene, and you're interfering with patient care. Please exit the residence immediately, or I'll have to call for police backup." The word police made Charlotte's face go pale, though she probably thought it was just because she didn't want to involve law enforcement in HOA business. When Charlotte and Marcus finally left, my mother was stable but exhausted from the asthma attack. The paramedics stayed for another 30 minutes, making sure her breathing was completely normal before they departed. As Jennifer was packing up her equipment, she pulled me aside. "Mr. Turner," she said quietly, "what these people are doing constitutes harassment of an elderly person, possibly to the point of elder abuse. This kind of stress can have serious health consequences for someone with your mother's condition. You might want to consider filing a police report." If only she knew that I'd been documenting everything for exactly that purpose, building a case that would soon put Charlotte Williams in handcuffs. By the time the ambulance cleared the street and my mother's breathing settled, the threshold had moved from nuisance to crime. The report would read elder abuse with aggravators tied to a medical scene and a documented refusal to leave. I reviewed the clip where Charlotte handled the inhaler during the attack and flagged it for the DA's intake. There wasn't anything left to debate. I put my badge on the table where she'd staged her photo, stepped into the driveway, and told her exactly what she was under arrest for. Barbara's asthma attack hadn't been random or coincidental. The stress of constant surveillance, the violation of her privacy, the fear of strangers entering her bedroom, all of it had built up over weeks until her respiratory system simply couldn't handle the pressure anymore. As I watched the paramedics work, I realized that Charlotte's harassment had literally endangered my mother's life. This wasn't about property values or community standards anymore. This was about a woman whose obsession with control had put an elderly person in the hospital. The medical equipment Charlotte had been photographing as evidence was now being used to save the life of the person she'd been systematically tormenting. When the paramedics finally cleared the scene and confirmed my mother was stable, I made a decision that would change everything. Charlotte and Marcus were still in our driveway, apparently arguing about whether they'd completed their inspection properly, when I walked outside and calmly pulled my sheriff's badge from my wallet. The leather case was worn from 15 years of daily use, the metal badge still bright despite countless calls and investigations. "Ma'am," I said in a voice that had suddenly shifted from confused homeowner to law enforcement officer, "you're currently engaged in unlawful entry and systematic harassment." The transformation was immediate and complete, 15 years of police training kicking in as I finally dropped the pretense that had been protecting Charlotte from her own actions for far too long. Charlotte's reaction was everything I'd hoped it would be, and more. She stared at the badge like it was some kind of optical illusion, her mouth opening and closing without any sound coming out. Her clipboard fell from nerveless fingers, scattering violation forms across our driveway. Marcus Thompson took one look at my credentials and immediately started backing toward his car, clearly wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. The man had apparently retained enough common sense to recognize when a situation had gone completely sideways. What do you mean?" Charlotte finally managed to stammer, her voice cracking on every word. "You're unemployed. You live with your mother. You were looking for work." The cognitive dissonance was written all over her face. She'd built her entire harassment campaign on the assumption that I was powerless to fight back, and now her fundamental understanding of the situation was collapsing in real time. "Ma'am, I'm Sheriff Aaron Turner, badge number 2847. I said, reaching for my radio with the same professional calm I'd used in thousands of other situations over the years. The radio was department issue, a Motorola unit that had seen me through countless domestic calls, traffic stops, and emergency responses. I'm currently on administrative leave helping my elderly mother, which doesn't change my law enforcement status or my understanding of criminal behavior. I watched Charlotte's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and growing panic as the implications hit her. The unemployed loser she'd been tormenting for 2 weeks was actually a decorated law enforcement officer who'd been documenting her crimes with professional precision. The radio crackled to life as I keyed the transmitter with practiced ease. "Dispatch, this is Turner requesting backup for a citizen arrest situation at 1543 Maple Drive. I need 1 unit for transport and evidence documentation. Suspect is in custody for unlawful entry harassment and elder abuse." The familiar routine of calling for backup felt surreal in my own driveway, but the professionalism was automatic after years of training. Charlotte's face went from pale to ashen as the reality of her situation finally hit her completely. She wasn't dealing with some powerless, unemployed guy anymore. She was looking at a cop who'd been documenting her crimes for weeks, building a case with the patience and thoroughness that had made me successful in law enforcement for over a decade. "But this is entrapment," Charlotte shouted right as the sirens bled into the cul-de-sac. I keyed my radio and kept my voice level while the lights flickered off porch glass up and down the street. "Dispatch Turner on scene with a citizen arrest for unlawful entry harassment and interference with medical care, evidence recording active, requesting transport and a 2nd unit for scene control." I stated for the record that consent had been denied multiple times and that her entry and persistence were documented on video and audio. The point wasn't to argue terms on a driveway. It was to lock the facts in live as procedure requires. The backup unit that rounded the corner was driven by Officer Miller, a 10-year veteran I'd worked with countless times before. His expression when he saw me in civilian clothes was priceless. Pure confusion, followed by recognition, then professional assessment of the situation. Miller was good at his job, thorough and careful, exactly the kind of officer you wanted handling evidence in a case like this. "Sarge," he asked, using the informal rank most of the younger officers called me, "what's the situation here?" I handed him my phone with the recorded evidence and gave him a brief overview of the systematic harassment, unlawful entry, and medical interference. Miller's expression grew more serious as he listened, especially when I explained about the master key abuse and the targeting of my elderly mother's medical conditions. This wasn't just neighbor drama anymore. This was a criminal case with multiple felony charges. Charlotte made one last desperate attempt to justify her actions, pulling out that emergency authorization document she'd been waving around for weeks, like it was some kind of magical legal talisman. "I have emergency authority under Charter Article 7, she declared, waving the paper at Officer Miller like it was some kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. Her voice was shrill now, panic making her sound increasingly unhinged as the reality of her situation sank in. Miller examined the document carefully, and I could see his expression change as he noticed what I'd suspected all along. The signatures looked fresh, the dates didn't align properly, and the supposed authorization was missing several required elements that would make it legally valid. "Ma'am," Miller said with professional courtesy, that somehow made his words more damning than any accusation. "This signature is dated incorrectly, and you don't have a proper quorum for emergency authorization according to your own charter requirements. This document doesn't give you the authority to enter private residences against the owner's explicit wishes, and it certainly doesn't override basic constitutional protections against unreasonable search and seizure." The systematic dismantling of Charlotte's legal justifications was swift and complete. Every argument she'd used to justify her behavior over the past weeks was crumbling under the scrutiny of trained law enforcement officers who actually understood how authority worked. The systematic nature of Charlotte's harassment was becoming crystal clear as Miller and I reviewed the evidence together. The timeline I'd documented showed escalating behavior over 2 weeks, with clear intent to intimidate and harass rather than any legitimate enforcement purpose. The photos Charlotte had taken of my mother's medications, her attempts to enter a bedroom during a medical emergency, her use of fraudulent master key access, each element built on the others to create a pattern that would be impossible to dismiss as simple overzealousness or misguided community spirit. This wasn't zealous HOA enforcement gone wrong. This was criminal harassment with special circumstances involving an elderly victim and systematic abuse of manufactured authority. When Officer Miller began reading Charlotte her Miranda rights from the card he kept in his patrol car, she made the mistake that sealed her fate completely and demonstrated just how desperate and unhinged she'd become. "You can't do this," she shouted, her voice echoing off the houses around us and drawing curious neighbors to their windows. "I know about the case from 15 years ago, the one Turner covered up. People need to know what kind of cop he really is." Miller stopped mid-sentence and looked at me with raised eyebrows, clearly wondering what Charlotte was talking about. Charlotte apparently thought she had some kind of leverage, some dark secret that would make this all go away and restore her position of power. What Charlotte didn't realize was that the corruption case from 15 years ago had been resolved completely legally, with full transparency and multiple oversight reviews that were all part of the public record. Every document was available for inspection, every procedure had been followed to the letter, and the case had resulted in successful prosecution because of thorough investigative work. Not any kind of cover-up or misconduct. The contractor who'd been defrauding the county had gone to prison. The taxpayers had recovered their money, and I'd received a formal commendation for the quality of my investigation. Charlotte's attempt at blackmail just added another charge to her growing list of problems: attempted extortion of a law enforcement officer, which carried its own serious penalties. As Miller finished reading the Miranda warning and prepared to apply handcuffs, Charlotte was still clutching my mother's asthma inhaler, the same medication she'd been photographing as potential drug paraphernalia just minutes before paramedics had used it to save my mother's life. The visual symbolism was perfect and damning. Charlotte Williams, HOA president, being arrested while holding evidence of her own victim's medical emergency. Officer Miller carefully documented the scene with his body camera, making sure to capture Charlotte's possession of medical equipment that belonged to the elderly woman she'd just helped send to the hospital through systematic harassment. What Charlotte thought was leverage was in practice a map, The app logs plotted her movements house by house. The notices stitched her language together into a pattern of pressure and escalation. The audio from today put her inside a private residence after consent was denied. My notes only had to bridge the times and anchor each piece to a human being who had to live with it. Miller Sprooks Med. The cross-checks clipped the phone back into his vest and told me transport was 3 minutes out. Sometimes criminals really are their own worst enemies, especially when they think their authority makes them untouchable. Charlotte's final words as Miller led her to the patrol car were telling and demonstrated that she still didn't understand the magnitude of her situation. "Turner, this isn't over. People need to know what kind of cop you really are. This whole neighborhood needs to know the truth." She was still trying to salvage something from the wreckage of her harassment campaign, still believing that attacking my character would somehow justify her criminal behavior and restore her position of authority. What she didn't understand was that her own actions had revealed exactly what kind of cop I was, the kind who follows proper procedures, documents, evidence, meticulously protects vulnerable victims from systematic abuse, and maintains professional composure even when being personally targeted by criminals. Charlotte Williams had spent 2 weeks unknowingly providing evidence for her own prosecution, and now she was going to face the full consequences of targeting the wrong family. The 15-year-old case Charlotte kept mentioning the DA's office called me that evening to clear up her allegations, and what they told me explained everything about Charlotte's recent behavior. She hadn't just been a witness in the contractor fraud investigation, she'd been the HOA representative who'd approved the fraudulent roadwork contracts in the first place. Charlotte had taken kickbacks from the contractor, small amounts that she'd thought would never be discovered. When the investigation started, she'd cooperated with authorities to avoid prosecution, but she'd never forgotten that her corruption was documented in official records. Her current harassment campaign wasn't just about power, it was about fear that someone might dig into her past connections to that old case. Officer Miller moved the scene forward before the adrenaline even wore off. While evidence technicians imaged my phone patrol, canvassed the block, and pulled 3 doorbell clips showing Charlotte timing her inspections to when elderly residents were home alone. Mrs. Wilson handed over the newsletter issue with the bar graph circled and a sticky note marking a copy-paste address error on page 2. 2 houses down the Thompsons produced a certified letter threatening fines for a hedge that didn't exist. The photo embedded in the notice was from a different street entirely. By sundown, the file wasn't just about my mother. It carried names, dates, and corroboration from people who had been too tired or too scared to complain until they saw handcuffs. News travels faster than patrol lights. By dusk, Knox came with affidavits half ready. A screenshot here, a doorbell clip there, a newsletter folded to the page with our blurred front porch. Mrs. Wilson stood on the step with a plate and a look that said she'd been sold the wrong story. She wasn't alone. People who had crossed the street all week asked where to sign and who to call. It wasn't hero worship. It was a neighborhood noticing the line they'd let someone else move and deciding it needed to go back. Emma Wilson, the nurse who'd tried to warn me about Charlotte's pattern of targeting other families, became crucial to building the broader case. She'd kept copies of threatening emails Charlotte had sent her about the garden violations, including one where Charlotte had explicitly threatened to make life miserable for anyone who doesn't respect community standards. Emma had also documented Charlotte's harassment of the Thompson family last year. Similar tactics, same escalating pattern, same abuse of HOA authority to target families she didn't like. The systematic nature of Charlotte's behavior was becoming clear, and Emma's evidence showed this wasn't an isolated incident, but a pattern of predatory enforcement. The news coverage was swift and damaging to Charlotte's reputation. HOA president arrested by sheriff she was harassing made headlines in the local paper, complete with photos of Charlotte being led away in handcuffs while still holding my mother's medical equipment. The story wrote itself. Power-mad HOA official systematically harasses family, unknowingly targets law enforcement officer, gets arrested for elder abuse and unlawful entry. The visual of Charlotte clutching that asthma inhaler while being arrested was particularly damning. It perfectly captured the cruelty and recklessness of her behavior toward my vulnerable mother. Other victims started coming forward once Charlotte's arrest became public knowledge. The Smith family from Oak Street had been driven out of the neighborhood last year after Charlotte filed 17 different violation complaints against their property in a single month. A local reporter called and asked for records. I told her to file requests for the newsletters meeting, minutes, and any board emails that mentioned emergency powers. She did, and looped in 3 former board members who had quit after one election cycle. Their resignations read polite. Their interviews did not. One described a vote taken by email at midnight. Another remembered a draft policy that would allow unannounced weekend checks. I did not give quotes about my mother. I pointed them to documents and let the paper speak in its own voice. Public sunlight is a better witness than outrage. The Johnsons had sold their house and moved after Charlotte convinced the HOA board to place a lien on their property for supposedly chronic landscaping violations. In each case, Charlotte had used the same tactics: minor complaints that escalated to harassment, social pressure through newsletter articles, and threats of legal action. The pattern was clear, and now other families realized they'd been victims of systematic abuse rather than legitimate enforcement. The corruption case connection added another layer to Charlotte's legal troubles. When the DA's office pulled the old files, they discovered that Charlotte's cooperation in the original investigation had been less than complete. She'd known about additional fraudulent contracts that she'd never reported, apparently, because she'd received financial benefits from them as well. The statute of limitations had expired on those charges, but the DA was very interested in Charlotte's recent statements about me covering things up. She'd basically accused a decorated sheriff of corruption while being arrested for elder abuse. Not the smartest legal strategy I'd ever witnessed. Charlotte's emergency charter authorization, the document she'd been waving around to justify her master key access, turned out to be completely fraudulent. Officer Miller had taken it to the courthouse for verification, and the records clerk couldn't find any matching authorization in the official files. The signatures Charlotte claimed were from HOA board members didn't match the signature cards on file. She'd essentially forged official documents to give herself authority she'd never actually possessed. This wasn't overzealous HOA enforcement. This was fraud, forgery, and systematic abuse of manufactured authority. My mother's medical privacy had been violated in ways that extended far beyond Charlotte's unauthorized photography. The HOA community app, where Charlotte had been posting compliance notifications, had apparently included medical information gleaned from her illegal inspections. References to pharmaceutical violations and health and safety concerns were scattered throughout Charlotte's digital documentation, creating a public record of my mother's private medical conditions. The Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act doesn't typically apply to HOA officials, but harassment targeting someone's medical conditions definitely falls under elder abuse statutes. The Master Key scandal expanded beyond just Charlotte's abuse of access. When investigators examined the HOA's key management records, they discovered that Charlotte had made unauthorized copies for herself and hadn't been logging her entries as required by the community charter. Several other families reported unexplained entries into their homes. Unlocked doors, they remembered locking items moved slightly, a general feeling that someone had been in their space. Charlotte had apparently been conducting unauthorized inspections throughout the neighborhood for months, possibly longer. The woman had turned the entire community into her personal surveillance operation. What finally snapped the picture into focus was the cadence. Pushes at 6:02 a.m., 11:47 p.m. Sundays between church and dinner, a rhythm you only see when someone confuses control with purpose. The app logs didn't just place her at addresses. They showed when she circled back after dark, and when messages spiked right after board votes. She thought the volume made her look diligent. On paper, it read like a person who couldn't stop. The community healing process began almost immediately after Charlotte's arrest. The new interim HOA president, Sarah Brooks, called an emergency meeting to address the master key abuse and implement new oversight procedures. No more unauthorized entries, no more emergency inspections without proper documentation, no more harassment disguised as community standards enforcement. The meeting was packed with residents who wanted to make sure nothing like Charlotte's reign of terror could happen again. People were angry, ashamed that they'd allowed the abuse to continue, and determined to prevent future victims. Emma Wilson's bravery in coming forward encouraged other witnesses to share their experiences with Charlotte's systematic harassment. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd gradually become more authoritarian and abusive over her 4 years as HOA president, using community safety concerns to justify increasingly invasive and punitive enforcement actions. Charlotte had created an atmosphere of fear where residents were afraid to complain, afraid to resist, afraid to support each other against her authority. Breaking that cycle of intimidation was going to take time, but Charlotte's arrest had given people permission to speak up about what they'd witnessed and experienced. The final twist in Charlotte's case came when investigators discovered she'd been in contact with the attorney from the drowning lawsuit. Not as a witness or defendant, but as someone trying to provide information that might discredit the family's claims. Charlotte had apparently been so worried about her own liability in the pool incident that she'd been actively working against the victim's family. Her harassment of our family wasn't just about power or control. It was about eliminating anyone who might examine her past actions too closely. She'd been trying to silence potential threats to her reputation, and she'd chosen the worst possible target for that strategy. 2 months later, Charlotte Williams stood before Judge Patricia Morrison in county court, facing a plea agreement that would define the rest of her life. The evidence against her was overwhelming. Dozens of photographs, recorded conversations, digital trail documentation, and witness testimony from multiple victims spanning several years. Her attorney had advised her that fighting the charges would likely result in much harsher penalties, especially given the elder abuse components and the systematic nature of her harassment campaign. Charlotte pleaded guilty to unlawful entry, harassment, elder abuse, and fraud in connection with the forged authorization documents. 6 months probation, 200 hours of community service, a permanent restraining order, keeping her away from my family, and complete removal from any HOA leadership positions. Judge Morrison's statement during sentencing was particularly pointed about the abuse of authority aspects of Charlotte's crimes. Ms. Williams, you used a position of community trust to systematically harass and intimidate residents who should have been able to rely on your protection. This kind of behavior undermines the foundation of community cooperation and cannot be tolerated under any circumstances. When it was my turn, I kept it short. I told the court my mother counted her pills out loud at the kitchen table after strangers photographed them. I said neighbors stopped waving for 2 weeks and then came back the day they saw a badge. I asked for terms that protected the quiet of old people and the right of anyone to close their own bedroom door. Charlotte stared at the table and did not speak. The gallery was full of residents who had learned each other's first names again. The judge also noted that Charlotte's targeting of an elderly person with medical conditions showed a level of cruelty that demanded serious consequences. The restraining order was comprehensive. Charlotte couldn't contact any member of our family, couldn't enter our property, couldn't even attend HOA meetings if we were present. The 15-year-old corruption case that Charlotte had tried to use against me was publicly reviewed by the DA's office as part of their investigation into her allegations. Every document was examined, every procedure was verified, and the conclusion was exactly what I'd expected. The original investigation had been conducted properly, all evidence had been preserved correctly, and the prosecution had been successful because of thorough police work, not any kind of cover-up. Charlotte's attempts to discredit me had actually resulted in official recognition of my investigative skills. Sometimes karma works in mysterious ways. The community changes implemented after Charlotte's arrest transformed the entire neighborhood dynamic. The new inspections require consent policy meant that HOA representatives couldn't enter private property without explicit written permission and 48 hours advance notice. Master keys were eliminated entirely. Emergency access now required actual emergency services coordination and proper documentation. Anonymous reporting systems were established so residents could report abuse of authority without fear of retaliation. Regular community feedback meetings gave everyone a voice in HOA management, preventing any single individual from accumulating the kind of unchecked power that Charlotte had abused. Rather than becoming the new HOA president myself, which several neighbors suggested, I accepted a position as community security consultant. My role was to establish proper protocols for handling disputes, training board members on legal limitations of their authority, and ensuring that future enforcement actions stayed within appropriate boundaries. It was volunteer work, but it felt good to use my law enforcement experience to prevent other families from experiencing what we'd been through. Charlotte had taught the entire community valuable lessons about the importance of oversight and accountability in positions of authority. My mother moved to a nice senior community about 20 minutes away where she could have her own independence without worrying about HOA harassment. She visits regularly and still sends cookies to the neighbors who supported us during Charlotte's harassment campaign. Barbara Turner had lived in that house for 30 years, but she decided she'd rather start fresh somewhere without the memories of violation and fear that Charlotte had created. The fact that an elderly woman felt she had to leave her longtime home because of systematic harassment was one of the most tragic aspects of Charlotte's behavior. The old backup camera system in my mother's closet, I kept it running even after she moved out, just in case. The house is still in our family use now as a rental property, and I want to make sure any future tenants are protected from the kind of abuse we experienced. Charlotte Williams may be on probation, but trust takes a long time to rebuild, and vigilance is the price of preventing future victims. The black box keeps recording a silent guardian against anyone who might think a clipboard and a bad attitude give them the right to violate other people's privacy and dignity. The peaceful ending I'd hoped for finally arrived on a Saturday afternoon 6 months after Charlotte's arrest. The neighborhood held its first community barbecue in years, with families actually talking to each other instead of whispering about violation reports and enforcement actions. Children played in yards without parents worrying about landscaping compliance. People felt free to express their personalities through their property choices without fear of harassment. It was remarkable how quickly the community healed once the source of fear and intimidation was removed. We'd locked the right door after all. And that's exactly what real justice looks like when someone abuses their authority and targets the wrong family. Sometimes the best defense against bullies is patience documentation and letting them destroy themselves with their own actions. Charlotte Williams learned the hard way that power without accountability always leads to consequences. Thanks for joining me on this wild ride through HOA Hell and Back. If this story resonated with you and you've got your own experiences with power-hungry neighbors or authority figures gone rogue, hit that like button to let me know. I'm your host at Echo Stories, where real-life drama meets real-world justice. Until next time, remember that sometimes the quietest person in the room has the loudest badge. See you in the next video.